Frank Miller, a retired air traffic controller, sought refuge from the crushing silence of his remote home in the crackle and hiss of his ham radio. It was his lifeline, a connection to a world he once commanded from a tower of glass and steel. But the familiar static he had come to find comforting is shattered one night by a distress call unlike any he has ever heard. The signal is a ghost, a fragmented, looping echo of a tragedy that hasn't happened yet. As the chilling message from the future becomes clearer, Frank realizes the events it foretells are beginning to materialize around him, plunging him into a desperate race against time itself to prevent a disaster that exists only as a phantom on the airwaves. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The ritual was the only thing that kept the silence at bay. Every evening, as the sun bled out behind the jagged peaks of the Appalachian Ridge, Frank Miller would descend the creaking wooden steps to his basement. This was his sanctuary, his command center, his radio shack. The air hung thick with the scent of old vacuum tubes, solder, and hot dust, a perfume of purpose. Banks of equipment, meticulously maintained, covered a long workbench. The soft amber glow of dials and gauges painted his face in warm light, a stark contrast to the encroaching darkness outside his small, isolated home. At 68, Frank was a man defined by patterns and precision. For 40 years as an air traffic controller, his life had been a symphony of interpreting faint signals, of pulling order from the chaos of the airwaves. He'd listen to disembodied voices crackling through headsets, pilots miles away in metal tubes, and his calm, measured responses would guide them through storms and darkness, keeping the delicate web of flight from tearing. He had been a guardian of the sky. Now he was just a widower, a guardian of his own solitude. His wife, Eleanor, had been gone for 3 years, and the quiet of the house was a physical weight he couldn't seem to shake. The ham radio was more than a hobby. It was a tether to the world, a way to fill the void with voices that didn't demand anything but a shared interest and a clear signal. He meticulously logged the atmospheric conditions in a leather-bound journal: barometric pressure, humidity, temperature. Tropospheric ducting looked promising tonight. He settled into his worn leather chair, the springs groaning in familiar protest, and slipped on his headphones. The world dissolved into a gentle hiss. He began to turn the large weighted tuning knob on his ICOM 7610, his fingers moving with the practiced ease of a musician. The bands were alive with the usual chatter. A gruff voice from Ohio discussing antenna configurations, 2 operators in Florida arguing about the best time to fish for marlin, the lyrical cadence of a Spanish station bleeding through from somewhere in the Caribbean. He often spoke with Sarah Vance, a younger operator from a town about 50 miles down the valley. She was a high school science teacher, bright and cheerful, and their conversations were a highlight of his evenings. She was his sounding board, the closest thing he had to a real friend since Eleanor passed. But tonight, he wasn't in the mood for conversation. He wanted to hunt, to explore the quiet corners of the shortwave spectrum. He moved past the busy frequencies into the higher bands that were often, deceptively, empty. These were the desolate highways of the air, where signals could travel for thousands of miles, bouncing off the ionosphere in a phenomenon radio enthusiasts called skip. It was like fishing in a vast, invisible ocean. You never knew what you might catch. Frank tuned to a band known for its silence, a dead zone where only the most powerful or most fortunate signals could penetrate. The hiss was deeper here, a bottomless static. He was about to move on when something snagged his attention. It was faint, buried deep within the noise like a whisper in a hurricane. He stopped turning the knob, his body tensing. He closed his eyes, concentrating, just as he had done countless times in the control tower when a pilot's voice was consumed by weather. There it was again, a voice, human and unmistakably panicked. He worked the filters, his hands flying across the console, tweaking knobs for noise reduction and adjusting the bandpass. The signal was a ghost, ephemeral and weak. It was layered with a thick, wet static, and beneath it, a rhythmic, grinding noise. A struggling engine. Frank's blood ran cold. He knew that sound intimately. It was the sound that preceded disaster. "Can't see! Mayday! Repeating!" The phrase was broken, torn apart by the journey through the atmosphere. It repeated, maybe 3 or 4 times, the exact same words, the same inflection of terror. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The frequency returned to the clean, empty hiss of the void. Frank sat back, his heart pounding in his chest. He took off his headphones, the sudden silence of the basement feeling unnatural. A skip. It had to be. A distant distress call from a boat in the Atlantic or a small plane over the Rockies, its signal ricocheting across the globe to land for a fleeting moment in his antenna. It was a rare catch, a fascinating anomaly, but nothing more. He logged it in his journal, his hand slightly unsteady. 2247 Zulu, unidentified distress signal on 27.555 megahertz. Male voice, panicked. Sounds of engine trouble. Signal repeated, fragment. Can't see, mayday, repeating, approximately 4 times. Faded completely. Probable E-layer skip from significant distance. The repeating nature was the strangest part. Most live distress calls were frantic, chaotic, but continuous. A repeating, fragmented loop suggested a recording. Maybe a prankster with a powerful transmitter playing a tasteless joke on the amateur bands, or a distress beacon test from a military or maritime authority. It was odd, but not impossible. He'd heard stranger things in his 40 years of listening. He tried to dismiss it, to put it in a neat box labeled unusual propagation. But as he switched off the glowing dials and the Radio Shack fell into darkness, the sound of that panicked voice and the grinding engine stayed with him. He climbed the stairs back to the crushing silence of his empty house, a new and unwelcome static clinging to the edges of his thoughts. The ridges outside were black against a star-filled sphad, but for the first time, Frank felt a profound sense of unease, as if he had overheard a secret the universe never intended for him to hear. The silence he had sought to escape now felt charged, expectant, as if it was waiting for an answer to a question he didn't know had been asked. The following day was a study in forced normalcy. Frank tended to his garden, repaired a loose shingle on the roof, and drove into town for groceries. He nodded to the familiar faces at the market, exchanging pleasantries that felt hollow and disconnected. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the fragmented signal, dissecting the phantom voice. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, a fluke, a ghost in the machine. Yet, the precision of the event, the timing, the repetition, gnawed at the edges of his orderly world. It was a loose thread in the fabric of his understanding, and his fingers itched to pull it. As dusk settled, casting long, menacing shadows across the valley, Frank found himself drawn back to the basement. The pull was undeniable. He told himself he was just being thorough, following professional protocol. An anomaly requires investigation. But he knew it was more than that. He was hoping not to hear it again. He powered up the rig, the familiar hum a low thrum of anticipation in his chest. He went through his ritual, logging the conditions, which were remarkably similar to the previous night. He spoke briefly with Sarah, his voice betraying none of the anxiety coiling in his stomach. She was excited about a new antenna she had installed, and he feigned interest, his mind already on the silent frequency. At 22:45 Zulu, 2 minutes before the appointed time, he tuned to 27.555 megahertz. The empty hiss filled his headphones. He watched the second hand on his wall clock sweep upward. His breath hitched. 22:46. The static remained unbroken. He felt a wave of relief so profound it almost made him laugh. It was a fluke, a one-time atmospheric trick. 22:47. Crack. The sound shot through the static like a bullet.
It was back, and it was clearer. The voice was still panicked, still desperate, but the words were more distinct now. The engine noise was louder, a gut-wrenching sound of metal tearing itself apart. And there was something else, a new sound that made the hair on Frank's arms stand on end. A child crying. A high, terrified wail, almost lost beneath the engine's roar and the man's frantic shouts. Mayday! Mayday! This is November 731 Delta Charlie. We are lost in the fog. Instruments are out. Oh God, the lights! The lights going out! The message played, a perfect, horrifying loop. The same words, the same sputtering engine, the same crying child. It lasted for perhaps 20 seconds, then faded into the hiss at the exact same moment it had the night before. Frank felt the blood drain from his face. This was impossible. A skip was a random event, a confluence of atmospheric conditions and signal strength. For it to occur on the same frequency at the exact same time, 2 nights in a row, was as likely as lightning striking the same grain of sand twice. His carefully constructed world of logic and physics began to crumble. His professional instincts, dormant since retirement, roared back to life. This was no longer a hobbyist's curiosity. It was an investigation. He had hit record the moment the signal started. Now, he routed the audio file to his computer, his hands moving with renewed purpose. He opened his spectral analysis software, the same kind he used to use to clean up faint transmissions from pilots in trouble. The waveform appeared on the screen, a jagged line of digital information. He began to apply filters, stripping away the layers of static, isolating the frequencies of the human voices. The man's voice became sharper, laced with a terror that felt chillingly authentic. The child's cries were heartbreakingly clear. He analyzed the engine noise, trying to identify the type. It sounded like a single propeller plane, a Cessna or a Piper, the kind that filled the small local airfield. This was no ordinary skip. This was no prank. The consistency, the clarity, the raw emotion, it was all too real. But how? During his scheduled chat with Sarah later that evening, he tried to sound casual as he described the signal. Picked up that strange loop again tonight, Sarah. Same time, same frequency. You're kidding, she said, her voice crackling with interest. That's bizarre. Did you record it? I did. Ran it through the filters. It's clearer now. A man, a call sign I don't recognize, and a child crying. There was a pause on her end. A kid? Frank, that's awful. Are you sure it's not some kind of War of the Worlds type broadcast? A radio drama? The production value is a little too good for that, Frank countered, trying to keep my tone light. And the signal behaves like a genuine long-distance transmission, not a local broadcast. The fade in and fade out are consistent with ionospheric skip. Okay, so what are you thinking? Sarah asked, her skepticism tempered with genuine curiosity. Maybe it's what they call a ghost loop. I've read about them. Sometimes, powerful transmissions from military bases or airports can get imprinted on the ionosphere under freak conditions. The recording can then be rebroadcast, sometimes for years. Frank considered this. It was a plausible, if exotic, explanation. It would have to be a hell of a freak condition to be this consistent, down to the second. Or, she offered, it's a local kid, maybe one of my students. Some of them are tech geniuses. They could have set up a transmitter on a timer, bouncing a signal off a repeater to make it sound distant. A prank, Frank. A mean-spirited elephant one, but a prank nonetheless. He knew she was trying to be rational, to provide an anchor in a sea of strangeness. He appreciated it, but her explanations didn't sit right. A prankster wouldn't have access to audio this convincing. The terror in that voice was not acted. And a military ghost loop wouldn't contain the sound of a crying child. He spent the rest of the night hunched over his computer, playing the recording again and again. He isolated the call sign, November 731 Delta Charlie, N731 DC. He ran it through the FAA database. No results. It was an unregistered tail number. This deepened the mystery. Was it a foreign aircraft? A decommissioned plane? The loop played on, a tiny 20-second snippet of hell. The voice, the engine, the crying. It was an echo of a disaster trapped in the ether. As the first light of dawn began to touch the peaks outside his window, Frank Miller realized he was no longer just listening. He was bearing witness. And the question that haunted him was no longer what he was hearing, but when.
The third night fell with a sense of grim inevitability. Frank didn't bother with the pretense of gardening or home repairs. The day was a long, anxious wait, a countdown to 22:47 Zulu. He ate without tasting, the silence of the house amplifying the looping recording playing in his head. He had spent the day refining the audio, applying every trick he knew. He'd managed to scrub away another layer of static, pushing the noise floor down until the voices stood out in stark, horrifying relief. He sat in his Radio Shack, the amber glow of the dials feeling less like a comfort and more like the instruments of a mad scientist. He didn't chat with Sarah. He couldn't. He needed absolute focus. At 22:46, he held his breath, his finger hovering over the record button. The clock ticked over. 22:47. It came, as punctual as death. And this time, it was almost perfectly clear. The atmospheric conditions must have been ideal for this strange temporal messenger. The hiss was a whisper behind the drama. Mayday, Mayday, this is November 731 Delta Charlie. We are lost in the fog. Instruments are out. Oh God, the lights going out. Lily, honey, it's okay, Daddy's here. The man's voice now had a name, a face. Frank's blood turned to ice in his veins. The world tilted on its axis. He knew that voice. He had heard it just last week at the hardware store, discussing the price of lumber. He had heard it at the local diner, ordering a coffee and a slice of pie. It was Tom Henderson, a young local pilot, maybe in his early 30s, who flew a small Cessna 172 out of the airfield a few miles from town. A friendly, confident man who always had a smile and a wave. And Lily. Frank knew Tom had a daughter. He'd seen them together at the town's summer picnic, a small girl with bright red pigtails. His mind reeled. The call sign, N731DC. He had searched the official FAA registry, but Tom's plane was a local private aircraft. Maybe he used an informal or incorrect call sign under duress, or maybe the database was slow to update. The voice, however, was undeniable. It was Tom Henderson, and he was going to die. Frank's hands trembled as he leaned closer to the speaker, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The loop played again, and he caught a new detail, a phrase he hadn't been able to isolate before, spoken in a moment of desperate orientation. Lost in the storm, can't see the ridge, the Founder's Day fireworks just started. The words hung in the air of the silent basement, colder and more terrifying than any scream. The Founder's Day fireworks. Frank scrambled for the community calendar hanging by his desk, a quaint thing with photos of local landmarks. He flipped the page to the current month, his eyes scanning the dates. His finger landed on a square, circled in red. Founder's Day celebration. It was next Saturday, 4 days from now. The truth crashed down on him, not with the force of a tidal wave, but with the cold, silent certainty of a final diagnosis. This wasn't a ghost loop from the past. It wasn't a prank. The signal wasn't just traveling through space, bouncing off the ionosphere. It was traveling through time. He was listening to a temporal echo, a psychic scar left on the fabric of space-time, broadcast back from the future. He was hearing the last, desperate moments of a plane crash that had not yet happened. He was listening to Tom and Lily Henderson die. The loop faded away into static, its job done. But the silence it left behind was different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the future. A future that was coming for Tom and his little girl. Frank stood up, his legs unsteady.
He looked at his reflection in the dark glass of a monitor, a wild-eyed old man, a witness to a future crime. His entire career had been about preventing disaster. He interpreted signals, saw patterns, and guided people to safety. He was a retired air traffic controller, a man of protocols and solutions. But what was the protocol for this? How do you stop an accident that hasn't occurred? How do you report a ghost? For the first time since Eleanor's death, the crushing weight of his loneliness was replaced by a far heavier burden, the weight of foreknowledge. He was the sole audience to a preview of a tragedy, and the curtain was set to rise in 4 days. The static on his radio was no longer just noise. It was the sound of a ticking clock.
The morning light felt like an accusation. Frank hadn't slept. He'd spent the night pacing his basement, the spectral voices of Tom and Lily Henderson echoing in the labyrinth of his mind. Panic was a raw, metallic taste in his mouth. He had to do something. The knowledge was a burning coal in his hands. He couldn't hold it alone. His first call was to the one person he thought was obligated to listen, Sheriff Brody. He found the number for the local station and dialed, his hand so slick with sweat he almost dropped the phone. Brody was a practical man, a former Marine who ran his small department with a no-nonsense attitude. He was fair, but had little patience for what he called mountain eccentricity. "Sheriff Brody," the voice on the other end answered, flat and professional. "Sheriff, this is Frank Miller." "Frank, everything all right up on the ridge?" Brody's tone was neighborly but cautious. Frank took a deep breath and the words spilled out, a frantic, jumbled torrent. He explained the signal, the nightly repetition, the impossible consistency. He talked about the voice, identifying it as Tom Henderson's, and the horrifying detail about the Founders Day fireworks. "I'm telling you, Brody, his plane is going to crash this Saturday during the fireworks. He has his daughter with him. We have to stop him from flying." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Frank could practically hear the sheriff pinching the bridge of his nose. "Frank," Brody said, his voice now gentle, the kind one uses with a spooked animal or a confused senior. "You're a ham radio operator, right? You know all about signals bouncing around, skips, all that atmospheric stuff." "This is not a skip," Frank insisted, his voice rising with desperation. He knew how he sounded, a crazy old man, a lonely widower losing his grip. "I have recordings. The signal is a temporal echo, a broadcast from the future." The word future hung in the air between them, and Frank felt the conversation die. "A temporal echo," Brody repeated slowly, without a trace of belief. "Look, Frank, I know it's quiet up there. Why don't you come down to the station? We can have a coffee, and you can play me these recordings." The offer was kind, but the subtext was clear. It was a wellness check, not an investigation. "There's no time. Saturday, Brody." "I'll tell you what," the sheriff said, his tone shifting to one of placation. "I'll make a point to swing by the airfield, check in on Tom Henderson, make sure his plane's in good working order. How's that?" Frank's shoulders slumped. He had laid out the impossible truth and had been met with gentle, pitying dismissal. He was Cassandra, screaming a prophecy that no one would believe. He hung up, the feeling of dread solidifying into a cold, hard knot in his stomach. If the law wouldn't listen, he had to go to the source. He drove his old pickup truck down the winding mountain road to the local airfield, a dusty strip of asphalt and a few hangars shimmering in the mid-morning heat. He found Tom Henderson doing a pre-flight check on his Cessna, a beautiful, gleaming white plane with blue stripes. His daughter, Lily, was chasing butterflies in a nearby patch of wildflowers. The idyllic scene was a gut punch. "Tom," Frank said, approaching cautiously. Tom looked up, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "Frank, good to see you. What brings you out here?" Frank's heart hammered. How could he possibly explain this? He decided to lead with the evidence. "I need you to listen to something."
He pulled out his phone and played the cleaned-up audio recording. The sound of Tom's own voice, raw with terror, filling the quiet air. The engine's death rattle, Lily's faint crying. Tom's cheerful expression vanished, replaced by a mask of confusion, then anger. He listened to the whole loop, his jaw tight. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice low. "I picked it up on my radio," Frank said, his own voice trembling. "It's been broadcasting every night for 3 nights." "This is sick," Tom said, snatching the phone and listening again. He was clearly unnerved, hearing his own voice in such a state, hearing the sound of his daughter's cries. "This is a prank, a really, really cruel prank. Who put you up to this, Frank? Is it one of the guys from the club?" "It's not a prank, Tom. It's a warning, Tom. In the recording, you mentioned the Founders' Day fireworks." Tom stared at him, his initial shock hardening into defensive disbelief. "So, everyone knows about the fireworks." "You have to cancel your flight on Saturday, Tom. You and Lily. The fog, your instruments failing. It's all in the signal." Tom shook his head, handing the phone back as if it were contaminated. "I've had enough of this. I don't know who you're working with, Frank, but you can tell them they didn't get a rise out of me. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a plane to check." He turned his back, a clear dismissal. Lily ran up to him and he scooped her into his arms, holding her tight, casting one last angry glare at Frank. Frank drove home, a profound sense of hopelessness washing over him. He had failed. He was the boy who cried wolf, but the wolf was real, and it was coming. That night, as he sat in his shack, a strange thing happened. When 2247 arrived, the signal came through, but it was different. It was distorted, filled with an angry, violent static he hadn't heard before. The voices were still there, but they were buried under layers of electronic rage, as if the universe itself was fighting back, punishing him for trying to look at its cards. His equipment, normally flawless, flickered. The lights in the basement dimmed for a second. He felt a palpable resistance, a pressure in the air, as if causality were a conscious entity, and it was angry. He was no longer a passive listener. By trying to intervene, he had become part of the equation, and the world was trying to balance itself to protect the integrity of the coming tragedy. He felt a chilling realization. He was no longer just fighting disbelief anymore. He was fighting the future itself.
The world's resistance didn't deter Frank. It galvanized him. The angry static, the flickering lights, it was confirmation. He was poking at something real, something that didn't want to be poked. If he couldn't convince anyone to believe him, he would have to act alone. He would not let a little girl die because the world refused to listen. He stopped thinking of himself as a harbinger of doom and reverted to what he was, an air traffic controller. The looping broadcast was no longer a prophecy, it was an accident report, filed in advance. His job was to deconstruct it, to understand every component of the impending failure, and to find a point of intervention. His basement transformed from a hobbyist's den into a full-blown incident command center. He pinned a large topographical map of the county to one wall. He spent the next 2 days in a state of obsessive focus, fueled by black coffee and a terrifying sense of purpose. He listened to the recording hundreds of times, his headphones clamped on, his eyes closed, shutting out everything but the 20 seconds of future horror. He broke it down piece by piece. First, the engine. The sputtering sound was specific. He cross-referenced it with audio archives of small aircraft engine failures. It wasn't a fuel starvation issue. It was rougher, more mechanical. It sounded like carburetor icing, a common problem in damp, cold conditions where moisture freezes and chokes the engine. The predicted fog for Saturday would create the perfect environment for it. Next, the location. Tom's voice mentioned being lost in the fog and that he can't see the ridge. Frank plotted Tom's likely flight path.
He planned to take off from the airfield, circle the town to watch the fireworks, and return. Frank knew this area like the back of his hand. There was one particular section, a blind valley north of town known as the Devil's Gap, where thick fog could roll in with shocking speed, trapping pilots between ridges with no visual landmarks. It was a notorious dead end. In the background of the recording, beneath the crying and the engine noise, Frank had isolated a faint, rhythmic sound. After hours of listening, he identified it: a train horn. The county's main freight line ran directly along the western edge of the Devil's Gap. It was a tiny detail, but it was a concrete piece of geography. Then the instruments. "Instruments are out," Tom had screamed. This was a critical piece. In thick fog, a pilot flies entirely by their instruments: the altimeter for height, the attitude indicator for orientation, the heading indicator for direction. If they failed, he would be flying blind in a sensory deprivation tank, susceptible to vertigo, completely unaware if he was climbing, diving, or turning upside down. Finally, the timing. The Founders' Day fireworks just started. Frank called the town hall, posing as a curious resident, and confirmed the fireworks display was scheduled to begin at precisely 9 p.m. on Saturday. This gave him a timeline. The crash would happen moments after 9 p.m. He had the what, the where, the how, and the when, all gleaned from a ghost on the radio. He sat back and looked at his wall of data: the map with its marked flight path, the notes on carburetor icing, the train line, the timing. It was a logical, data-driven analysis of a potential disaster. The supernatural origin of the information was now irrelevant. The threat was plausible. The risk was real. He knew he couldn't do it all himself. He needed an ally. He needed Sarah. He called her, his tone different this time, not panicked, but professional and urgent. "Sarah, I need your help, and I need you to put aside the temporal echo theory for a minute and just listen to the data." He laid it all out for her, step by logical step. He didn't talk about ghosts or the future. He presented it as a risk assessment. "I have an audio recording that suggests Tom Henderson's Cessna is prone to carburetor icing. The weather forecast for Saturday evening indicates prime conditions for that to occur. If his instruments were to fail, his most likely point of disorientation would be the Devil's Gap, especially with the fog that's predicted. The timeline of his planned flight coincides perfectly with these risk factors." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. He could hear the gears turning in her scientifically minded brain. The message from the future was still a barrier for her, but the meticulous, evidence-based case he presented was undeniable. He sounded like the expert he was. "Frank," she said slowly, "your theory about where the signal came from, it's still hard to swallow. But your analysis of the potential danger is sound. It's solid. Even if the recording is a hoax, it's a hoax that has pointed out a very real possibility of a tragic accident." Relief washed over Frank. "So you'll help me?" "What do you need?" she asked, her voice now firm. "On Saturday night, I need you on a separate channel. I need you to be my weather station. Give me real-time updates on the fog, wind speed, temperature, anything that could affect the flight. You'll be my eyes and ears for the atmosphere, while I handle the pilot." "Okay, Frank," she said, "I'm in. Let's hope your disaster scenario is just that, a scenario." "Me too," Frank said grimly, "but I'm not betting a little girl's life on it." The pieces were on the board. The clock was ticking down. He had less than 2 days to prepare for the storm. Founders' Day dawned with a deceptive beauty. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, but Frank, who had been studying meteorological charts for 48 hours straight, knew it was a lie. A low-pressure system was moving in from the coast, carrying with it a payload of cold, moist air. By nightfall, the valley would be choked with a thick, unseasonable fog. The Echo had predicted it, and now science was confirming it. Frank spent the day in his command center, running drills in his mind. He calibrated his equipment, checking every cable and connection. He had 2 receivers active, one tuned to Tom Henderson's expected frequency, the other to the haunted channel of 27.555 megahertz. He wanted to hear both. He needed to hear both. In town, the celebration was in full swing. Frank could hear the distant sounds of music and laughter carried on the breeze, a festive counterpoint to his own grim preparations. He imagined Tom and Lily there, enjoying the day, oblivious to the future hurtling toward them. Tom, stubborn and proud, would see the beautiful weather as proof that Frank was a crazy old man. He wouldn't cancel his flight. Frank knew it in his bones. He had to proceed as if the flight was an absolute certainty. As the afternoon wore on, the first tendrils of fog began to creep over the western ridge, pale, ghostly fingers reaching down into the valley. It was happening exactly as the data predicted. At 7 p.m., he got on the radio with Sarah. "How's it looking from your end?" he asked. "Thick and getting thicker, Frank," her voice crackled back, all business. "The temperature is dropping fast. It's a perfect recipe for what you were worried about. I wouldn't want to be in the air tonight." Frank's phone rang. It was Sheriff Brody. "Frank," the sheriff said, his tone lacking its usual placidness, "this fog is something else. You really got me spooked with your talk the other day. I'm not saying I believe in temporal echoes, but I've got a patrol car sitting near the airfield entrance, just in case." A small measure of relief. At least someone else was watching. "Thank you, Sheriff," Frank said, his voice tight. At 8:45 p.m., the patrol officer radioed Brody, who relayed the information to Frank. "He's taking off. Tom Henderson just taxied onto the runway. He's got the girl with him." Frank's heart sank. It was real. All of it. He sat before his console, the two receivers hissing softly. The shack was a bubble of intense, focused silence. Sarah was feeding him constant weather updates. Dew point and temperature are nearly identical, visibility dropping to less than a quarter mile in the northern valley. Dusk bled into night. The fog outside Frank's window was a solid wall of gray. The town below, with its festive lights, had vanished completely. Then, at 9 p.m. sharp, a muffled thud echoed through the fog, the first firework, followed by another and another, a phantom celebration no one could see. Frank's radio crackled to life. It wasn't the echo. It was a live transmission, raw and immediate, breaking through the static on the local aviation frequency. "Mayday, Mayday, this is November 731 Delta Charlie." The voice was Tom Henderson, and it was filled with pure, undiluted terror. "We're in the fog, completely blind. My instruments, they're not reading right. The engine is sputtering. Oh, God." In the background, Frank could hear the high, piercing cry of a terrified child. The future had arrived.
The moment the live distress call came in, 40 years of training took over. The fear, the doubt, the supernatural horror, it all receded, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged professionalism. Frank Miller, the lonely widower, vanished. In his place sat Frank Miller, Senior Air Traffic Controller. November 731 Delta Charlie, this is amateur station Kilo 4 Foxtrot Tango. I read you 5 by 5. I am a retired controller. I am here to help you, Frank transmitted, his voice calm, steady, and authoritative. The voice he had used to talk down pilots from the edge of panic 1,000 times. There was a half-second of silence, then Tom's frantic voice shot back. "Who is this? I can't reach the tower. I'm flying blind." "My name is Frank. Don't worry about the tower, son. Worry about me. I have you. Now, what is your last known heading and altitude?" As Frank engaged the live Tom, a second sound began to bleed into his ears from the other receiver. On 27.555 megahertz, as punctual as a phantom train, the echo began its nightly broadcast. "Mayday, Mayday, this is November 731 Delta Charlie. We are lost in the fog." The climax was a terrifying, schizophrenic duet. In one ear, Frank heard the real-time disaster unfolding. In the other, he heard the ghostly recording of its tragic conclusion. He was listening to Tom's future screams while trying to prevent them. The echo was a siren song of failure, a constant, looping reminder of the inevitable. He had to mentally build a wall between the two signals, to filter out the sound of the ghost to save the man. "My altimeter is spinning. My attitude indicator is frozen," the live Tom screamed.
Forget your instruments, Tom. They are lying to you, Frank commanded. This was the crucial moment. This was the knowledge gleaned from the future. You have spatial disorientation. Do not trust what your body is telling you. Trust me. Trust my voice. The light's going out. Lily, honey, it's okay, the echo whispered in his other ear. Sarah, give me a weather update for the Devil's Gap, now, Frank barked into a secondary microphone connected to her frequency. Wind shear reported at 800 feet, Frank. It's a mess in there. Sarah's voice came back, tense but clear. Tom, you are experiencing carburetor ice. It's choking your engine. I need you to apply full carburetor heat. Now, Tom. Carb heat is on, Tom responded, a flicker of hope in his terror. The engine, it's running a little smoother. On the other channel, the sound of the ghostly engine sputtered and died, followed by the sound of tearing metal and a final, awful scream. Frank flinched but did not break. He had to fight it. He was rewriting the ending of this tape as it played. Good, Tom. Now you need to turn. You're headed for the ridge, Frank said, looking at the map on his wall. Your instincts are telling you to climb. Do not climb. I need you to make a gentle, standard rate turn 20 degrees to the west, now. West? That feels wrong. That feels like I'm diving, Tom yelled back, the vertigo clearly taking hold of him. It feels wrong because the future I'm trying to stop ends with you flying into a granite wall, Tom. Frank let a sliver of the raw truth into his voice. You have to trust me. 20 degrees west. Your life depends on it. He was talking the pilot through the exact moments he knew would lead to the crash. He was fighting his own precognitive knowledge, using the ghost's script to change the outcome. The echo played on, a macabre commentary track. He could hear the future crash, the final silence, while he fought to create a new sound, a new future. For a horrifying minute, the live transmission and the echo synced perfectly. The same words, the same terror, playing in tandem. It felt like the universe was trying to snap the timeline back into place. But Frank held his ground. Hold that heading, Tom. Just hold it steady. Keep the wings level. Listen to the sound of my voice. Ignore the ghost.
The battle of the airwaves raged for what felt like an eternity. Frank was a rock, his voice a lifeline, cutting through the chaos of static, fog, and fear. He fed Tom Henderson instructions, precise and unwavering, drawing on a mental map illuminated by the ghost's tragic flight path. He guided him away from the Phantom Ridge, talked him through the engine struggle, his words a shield against the siren call of vertigo. The entire time, the echo played in his other ear, a relentless 20-second loop of failure. It was the sound of the future that causality demanded, but Frank refused to yield. You should be seeing a break in the fog below you, Tom, Frank said, his own voice hoarse with tension. Look for the lights of the freight train. It will be your guide. There was a tense silence, broken only by the sputtering engine and the looped recording of the crash. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Frank held his breath. Then, a new voice crackled over the radio. It was Tom Henderson's, shaky, breathless, but miraculously clear. I see it! My God, I see it! The train! I'm below the fog bank! I'm through! At the exact moment Tom's live voice broke through with the sound of hope, the ghostly echo on 27.555 megahertz played one final time. The panicked voice, the crying child, the sound of the crash, it all spooled out, and then, instead of looping again, it dissolved. The angry, crackling static vanished, replaced by a profound, clean, empty hiss. The temporal loop was broken. The channel was clear. Frank slumped in his chair, the strength draining from him. He listened as Tom, his voice thick with emotion, reported he had safely landed in a large field adjacent to the railway tracks. He had done it. He had changed the future. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway outside broke his trance. A few moments later, Sheriff Brody appeared at the basement door. He didn't say a word. His face, illuminated by the glow of the radio equipment, was a mask of awe and terror. He had been listening to the entire exchange on his own radio. He had heard the mayday. He had heard Frank's impossible guidance. He had heard the result. He simply looked at Frank,
nodded slowly, and believed. The next day, a quiet, tearful Tom Henderson and his daughter Lily, who was clutching a teddy bear, came to Frank's house. There were no easy explanations for what had happened. Tom didn't ask how Frank knew. He didn't need to. He had lived both potential futures in the space of 10 minutes. He had felt the cold hand of the one Frank had heard, and he had been pulled back by Frank's voice into the warmth of the other. There was only a profound, shuddering gratitude that transcended words. He just hugged the old man, a long, silent embrace that said everything. Months passed. The Appalachian ridges cycled through autumn's fire and into the stark white of winter. Frank's life returned to a quiet rhythm, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was no longer the sound of loneliness, but the sound of peace. The story ends with Frank back in his radio shack. He still chats with Sarah, their conversations now laced with an unspoken understanding. He is no longer just a hobbyist killing time. He is a guardian, a listener on the wall of time, a watchman on the shores of the invisible ocean. He turns the large, weighted knob, scanning the empty frequencies. He hears only static, but now he knows that silence isn't always empty. Sometimes it's the sound of a future that is safe. Sometimes the most beautiful signal is no signal at all. He makes an entry in his leather-bound logbook. He notes the date, the time, and the atmospheric conditions. In the large space for observations, he writes only 3 words. The channel is clear. And for the first time in years, Frank Miller felt a profound sense of peace. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.